Well, it's good to be with you. This is the only major speech I give every year to the Highland group, and so I see a lot of familiar faces here, and it's good to see you. My wingman from the F4 squadron, Randy Sturgill, is here tonight. I want to give a big shout out to Randy. He's a great pilot and a great friend. We joined the squadron that just came back from Vietnam when we were stationed in Hawaii in Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station. And unfortunately brought back all their unsavory habits that military men do when they're overseas and away from their wives. And so we had a battle royal in the squadron because we didn't want to attend the command function parties that the skipper, a full bird colonel, was putting on with nude women and prostitutes and other things there. Of course, the wives were not invited. But I told him, I said, it's dangerous to invite us Mormons to your party because we're going to tell. Well, he would scream and yell at me every morning as I'd come into the squadron and couldn't understand why I didn't want to attend his parties, because other Mormons who had been in his squadron before did attend his parties. Now, they drank root beer rather than the liquor, but still, we felt it necessary to give a protest for the moral problems involved. The Marine Corps talked about honor, duty, and country and morality, and yet we weren't living it, or at least they weren't living it. And so we got kicked out after we got our training through and went into the group headquarters where we were adversary pilots against the squadron and had a great deal of fun shooting them down. But in any case, the military now is much worse now. It's a woke military, and we could see it coming even when we were in the military. We knew that you couldn't get through the National War College, which is what all future general officers have to go through, which were taught by globalists from Georgetown University. You couldn't get through that and pass and get to be a general admiral unless you agreed with the globalist agenda. And that's why you have so many woke generals nowadays, and admirals, joint chiefs of staff, etc. I put in the World Affairs Brief that they just picked an anti-Trump professor from New York University to speak to the Naval Academy, the graduates there. And she openly said, I'm going to attack Trump the entire speech, which is not allowed by law. Taxpayers are not allowed to pay for partisan speakers at the Naval Academy or any of the other federal offices, and yet they did it anyway. So they thumbed the nose at the law. There's a lot of specific things we could talk about today, specific problems. I've probably got 4 hours in my brain that I could tell you about, but I'm going to limit myself to the history of the deep state, or more particularly the globalist deep state, from 1900 on. Now, we have lived with secret combinations of power since Adam and Eve. Cain was the first master Mahan who made pacts with Satan. He was perdition before this world, and that's why he was cursed with a severe curse of blackness and other things that no longer carries forth, but secret combinations have. Those of you who are Mormons in this Utah audience know that in the Book of Mormon they dealt a lot with secret combinations of power. And even when they eradicated them by killing them all off and burning their records, guess what? Satan re-revealed it, so it came back again. So this is ultimately a satanic thing that we're dealing with. And that's one of the problems with Donald Trump, is that he doesn't recognize that there's systematic evil in the world. And a lot of naive liberals just say, why can't we all get along? Why can't we have peace? Well, the reason we can't all get along is because there's systematic evil. And that evil is in every one of your minds. I've talked a lot in prior speeches to this group about the workings of conscience. In conscience, we think mostly about the divine promptings and warnings and help that we get from God through conscience, but Satan is also right there parked in your mind, ready to counter everything that God tries to get you to do. You see, you're resistant naturally to the promptings of God, because he's after you. He's after you to change your innate weaknesses. And you don't want to change them. You're comfortable with what you are. That's why you haven't changed. You're comfortable. And every time the Lord prompts you to do something like lose weight or exercise or stop eating junk food, Satan's right there saying, oh no, it's all right. You can do it later. You can do this. It's always that calming voice. And when you preach the soft version of Jesus Christ, which we all do in the churches nowadays, you're taught, that the negative voice is not the Lord, that's always Satan, but the positive voice, that's the Lord. But it's not true. Oftentimes the calm, soothing, positive voice is Satan making you feel calm about things you shouldn't feel calm about. You see, the Lord tries to make you feel nervous about things that you shouldn't be doing, and Satan tries to make you feel calm about it and comfortable. That's what rationalization is all about. So this is a satanic world that we're living in, and he's going to have more and more power before the second coming of Christ. And it has a great deal to do with what I'm going to tell you about the globalist agenda from 1900 on. Because you have to understand, this is the world you're living in. You're living in a world where the globalists are attempting to use war and enemies they create to actuate or cause those wars to get you to accomplish or do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. This is the Hegelian dialect, which is you create conflict so that you can provide solutions which people would not normally accept. Now, this started off in 1900 when they decided that they needed to have a president other than William Howard Taft, who was a conservative. And so they decided to run Woodrow Wilson for the presidency. And why Wilson? Because they had dirt on him. He was the president of Princeton University in New Jersey, and then became the governor of New Jersey, and he had an affair with his secretary, a long-time affair. And in those days, an affair was a disqualifier for being president. It is no longer that, unfortunately. Every single candidate for president, except myself, has had multiple affairs and cheated on their wives, including Donald Trump. But in those days, it was a very it was a disqualifier. And it was going to be very difficult to overcome the popularity of William Howard Taft, and so they tapped on Teddy Roosevelt, former president, before William Howard Taft, to run again as a third-party candidate, the Bull Moose Party. And that's how they split the vote. And in fact, Taft came in third. Wilson came in first, and then Roosevelt, and then Taft. And that's how they split the vote. And they've done that a couple of other times since then. Remember Ross Perot, that's how they got Bill Clinton into office, by splitting the vote away from another globalist, by the way, George H.W. Bush. And that's an interesting story in itself, why they wanted one globalist against another. But they used Ross Perot to split the vote off to do that. And they tried to do that with Robert F. Kennedy splitting the vote off from Donald Trump. They actually told the Democratic Party, don't let him in the primaries, kill his candidacy, let's force him to be an independent, because they, in those days, wanted to split the vote off from Donald Trump, or at least when they stole the vote from Donald Trump, which they fully intend still to do, they wanted to have an excuse so that it wasn't as obvious as it was in 2020. They wanted to have an excuse, so they had a third party in there who, Bobby Kennedy, would have garnered a lot of conservative votes. Why? Because he is savvy about at least half of the conspiratorial theory that's going on. He knows that the deep state killed his uncle JFK and his father RFK and Martin Luther King. And he's very much aware of the conspiracy between Big Pharma and its control of the FDA and the CDC and the falsification of the trials on vaccines and how dangerous they are. And what I said in the World Affairs Brief is, joining forces now with Donald Trump guarantees that Donald Trump will never become president. Because remember, Donald Trump could be fooled. He can be manipulated. He wasn't a conservative when he became president. He'd never been a conservative. He was best friends with Hillary and Bill Clinton. But still, Donald Trump had good basic feelings about Americana. Didn't think deeply about anything political. lives by briefings, both in his financial world and his political world. And you're only as good as your briefings when you don't do any homework. You're only as good as your briefings. And he listens to Fox News, by the way. So he does get some conservative element. But you know, Fox News will never say anything about conspiracy. In fact, Bill O'Reilly will crucify you when he was, you know, a top man at Fox News. If you ever got on the telephone and brought up conspiracy about 9/11 or JFK or any of those things. And Sean Hannity's the same way. And Tucker Carlson would touch the subject here and there, but he's basically still ignorant about conspiracy. And I'm going to talk about that and how that allowed him to get deceived royally by Vladimir Putin in his interview by him. But the point is that you've got to know some of these things in order to be president. You've got to know these things to be able to discern what is true and what is not true. But let me get back to the beginning of history. The reason they wanted Woodrow Wilson in there as a puppet president, and a puppet president always has to have a handler. Edwin Mandel House was his handler, a pure globalist. He's the one who talked him into World War I. He gave him all of the material to be able to pass the Federal Reserve, and the income tax was the first thing he got passed as soon as he got elected. Only a globalist would have done that. And those two were very deceptive. You know, the banks claimed to be against the Federal Reserve. You know, they know there was a populist movement. Anything the bankers want must be wrong. So the bankers came out against the Federal Reserve, said, well, the bankers are against them, we've got to be for it. And that's how they fooled the public into voting for the Federal Reserve and the income tax. But in any case, the Lusitania was sunk in 1915, and it had been leaked to the Germans that there were arms shipments in the hold of the Lusitania, and that's why they torpedoed it. And they wanted it sunk because that was a prelude to getting us into war. But Woodrow Wilson, on the advice of Edwin Mandel House, said, your campaign has to be, he kept us out of war. And this is typical lie, just like Kamala Harris. What is she campaigning on? I'm going to build a border wall. I'm going to stop illegal immigration. Who believes that? Nobody believes that. But that's the way politicians operate nowadays. They tell people what they want to hear, and then they do what they want to do once they get in office. And so Woodrow Wilson won the presidency based on he kept us out of war, and then he got us immediately into war in 1917 in World War I. Now, World War I, the globalists have two purposes in getting us into world wars, and one of those is to get us into a global government. And why a world war? How's that related to a global government? Because a world war requires an international solution, right? If it's just a civil war, what do other countries have to do? They don't have to join a global government to solve a civil war in the United States. And that didn't happen in our own civil war. But in a world war, where all the nations of the world are impacted, that's a reason to have a major international global organization. And so Woodrow Wilson set his sights on the League of Nations, spent his last political capital, and died a broken man because he was not able to get the League of Nations passed, mostly because of William Howard Taft and the America First people. They did not want to get into World War I, and they did not want to get into an international, and so it failed. But the globalists always have a backup plan. And the backup plan was make the Treaty of Versailles at the conclusion of World War so onerous to Germany that it would guarantee that they'd have to come to war again. So if we fail in the League of Nations, we'll get another chance in another war that they set up. So every world war they set up for a follow-on war and a follow-on enemy. And you've got to see this pattern. Now, the follow-on enemy was going to be communism. And the globalists began to build communism even before Woodrow Wilson was elected. Leon Trotsky, a Marxist from Europe, was booted out of Europe, and he sought sanctuary in the U.S. and was granted it by the Wilson administration. Wilson administration gave Leon Trotsky, well, it was actually Jacob Schiff, one of the Wall Street brokers, gave him $10,000 to go back to Russia to help start the Russian Revolution. Lord Milner of Britain, one of the first globalists in the UK, and that's where globalism actually started, in the city of London. London, it's not London proper. The city of London is a small financial center within London, and that's where the globalists had their headquarters for many years, and still do to a certain extent, but now the US has basically taken over the globalist movement because of its power, both financially and militarily. But anyway, the globalists gave 20 million rubles in Russian currency to the Bolsheviks to fund the Bolshevik Revolution. And then when that was in the process of the revolution, the United States are the good guys. There's always a white side in government and a dark side. The good guys in the Wilson administration, and the military in particular, decided to send an entire brigade of US soldiers to Murmansk in the Arctic to help fund and provide weapons for the White Russian army to fight the Bolsheviks. And eventually Edmund Mandel House and the Wilson administration got the military to cut off funding, and that's why the Bolshevik revolution succeeded, because they cut off military funding to the White Russian army. Now, a lot of those White Russian army people defected and left the Soviet Union rather than live under Bolshevism, and they went into Eastern Europe. They would surface again in World War II and fight for Germany against the Soviet Union. Entire armies of former White Russian soldiers who were defeated and because of lack of arms from the US. And I'll get to what happened to them and how they were betrayed by our own Western globalists at the end of World War II. But the Treaty of Versailles was onerous. It required huge repayments to the Allied countries for World War I, reparations, in gold marks. Now, the German currency at the time was a gold-backed currency, and that's what the Allies wanted to get their hands on. Well, the Germans couldn't possibly pay all the reparations because of the destruction of the war in Germany. And so they began, well, it's not that they began, Wall Street advisors came over to Germany and convinced the Weimar Republic to stop backing their currency with gold and to print fiat money. And so they began to pay their reparations in not gold marks, but the new mark, which was fiat currency, at the advice of globalists who came over from Wall Street. All this is detailed in Anthony Sutton's two books. Well, there's Wall Street and the Rise of Bolshevism and Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. And basically the globalists, the financiers in New York, financed both of these revolutions and these wars. But the interesting thing about the demise of the Weimar Republic, it was based on fiat currency that was imposed upon them because of the necessities of the Versailles Treaty, the imposition of the reparations. France decided to reject the paper currency of Germany, and they invaded the Ruhr Industrial District, which was producing all the coal and steel for Germany. That's what built their war machine. They began to take all the coal and steel away from Germany and didn't pay any of the workers and forced them to work as slaves. So the German government in the Weimar Republic decided to start paying the salaries of the German coal and steel workers in the Ruhr District. And pretty soon it began to inflate the currency and the values of prices in Germany because everything else was in depression except the Ruhr Industrial District, which was getting paid by fiat currency. And so there was a demand that everybody get paid. And so the Germans went to the Wall Street advisors and they told them, what you need to do is index everybody's salaries to the rate of inflation so that there won't be any protest. Everybody's salary will automatically rise. If the prices rise 10%, their salaries rise 10%. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you get hyperinflation. That's how it happens. How else do you have wheelbarrows full of $100,000 marked bills, wheelbarrows full to buy a loaf of bread? It's because there's no resistance to price increases. The government will make it good. Your salaries will automatically increase. Now, what did this do? What was the globalist interest in destroying the currency of Germany? It's because it destroyed capitalism in Germany. It destroyed free markets. You see, who got the blame for the fiat currency? The Weimar Republic, which was a free market. And who got, what this did was allow for the rise of communism in Germany. Now, communism had been around before with Karl Marx and others, but it was a growing movement. And that's what blew up in the Weimar Republic's face and got all of these protests in favor of communism was the inflation of the currency. And what gave rise to Nazi socialism? The rise of communism. We've got to have a replacement for communism because it's a ruthless and it's part of the Soviet Union. So that is what gave rise to Adolf Hitler and Nazi socialism, is the rise of communism. You see, it all started with hyperinflation, which was blamed on capitalism, which gave rise to communism, and then it gave rise, and Hitler, you read all his writings, we've got to stop this communist menace. Very slick, isn't it? How these types of things happen. And so Germany rearmed, went to war, and the United States then decided to back the Soviet Union and count as an ally. Now this is the globalists once again. They built up Russian communism. Now they're in World War II because, and by the way, they built up Hitler too. Who invested in all of the German armament in Krupp Incorporated? It was the Wall Street brokers. They were the ones that invested in. They built them up. But before the war started, they cut off their investment and they turned the corner and they started to attack Hitler. Now you'll see this happen again in your own time. Remember that though. The capitalists and who are globalists, not all capitalists are globalists, but these, the big ones, and by the way, you know, the capitalists like Carnegie and Rockefeller, they made their money through capitalism, didn't they? But as soon as they got wealthy and people started to rise up to compete with them, what did they do? They go to government to get monopoly status and to get government contracts. And then they become socialist, as Carnegie became and Rockefeller became, or globalist, which is a form of socialism, milder than communism, but still socialist. But they still tell you you're free under their form of socialism. You just get regulated to death. But that's what happens. And so those particular globalists now harness the power of government to build a future enemy in Adolf Hitler. But as soon as he gets big enough and starts to take on Austria and Czechoslovakia and then Poland, they turn against him and you gin up the war, and they make money now, what? Building up arms in the United States, and that's what happened during World War II. But the globalists also then decided that we've got to back the Soviet Union in order to win the war. And Americans tend to think, well, that was rational because Germany was so powerful we couldn't have won the war. And that's partially true unless we built up. But the globalists had an ulterior motive. They're going to build a next enemy after we defeat Hitler. And so what did we do? We built arms factories there. We gave them plans to the B-29 bomber. We gave them plans to all of our aircraft. We set up factories for them. We set up truck factories for them. And you know, your grandmothers will tell you you couldn't buy washing machines or sewing machines in the United States during the World War II, right? But you know what was sent over during Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union? Sewing machines and washing machines for Soviet women. Why? Just crazy what was going on. But that's not all. Once the war was won, do you know what happened after Lend-Lease? We gave the Russians the rest of the plans to the nuclear weapons that they couldn't steal in the Manhattan Project. We know that because of Major Racy Jordan's diary. You can still see it and read it on Amazon. Still there, Racy Jordan's diary. It's a great read, how he found these 4 great big black trunks marked diplomatic baggage being shipped off from Great Falls, Montana Air Base to the Soviet Union, and he decided, he had nervous feelings. He had a good conscience. He had nervous feelings about it, and he decided, I'm going to break open those boxes. And the Soviets had a fit, of course. And he found the plans to the nuclear weapons inside. And so he said, well, you're not having these. And half an hour later, gets a call from the White House, the Truman White House. Harry Hopkins, Soviet agent in the Truman White House, calls him and said, give those plans back to the Soviet Union and don't tell anyone about it. Well, he wrote it in his diary, so we all know about it, though you never knew about it before because the media won't tell you about that. But that's not the half of it. Do you know that we gave them the first shipment of enriched uranium because they didn't know how to enrich uranium so that they could explode their first nuclear weapon by 1949? We made Russia a nuclear power. It's the strongest nuclear power in the world today, and our own globalists did that. And that's not the end of what they gave to them. But then the Soviets began to build up Mao Zedong in China. And our own globalist, George Catlett Marshall, who was the one running World War II under the aegis of the UN, and the UN was being used, we found out after the war that UN language was used all through the documents in World War II, 2 years before the UN was formed. United Nations troops, United Nations plans, United Nations approval for this and that. It wasn't formed formally until 1945, but they were already acting under the UN before that. And guess who wrote the charter for the UN? A guy named Alger Hiss, who was another communist in the Roosevelt administration, who wrote the charter of the United Nations, which we all signed on to. Now, actually, it's my opinion that Alger Hiss was not a communist. I think he was a globalist that went and joined the Communist Party, and he did join, even though he lied about it to the McCarthy hearings, denied that he was ever a communist. But he was exposed by another communist in the same cell that he was, who testified at the House Un-American Activities Committee that he was a communist. But I think he was a globalist that joined the Communist Party so that as he betrayed his own nation to the communists, they wouldn't wonder what he was doing. Oh, he's one of us. He's secretly one of us. Same thing happened to Henry Kissinger. After World War II, he was a soldier in West Germany, went over to East Germany and joined the Communist Party. But Henry Kissinger is not a communist. He's a globalist. But he was incremental, and I'll tell you the story about Vietnam, of giving away Vietnam to the Vietnamese and Red China in the UN, so that the Chinese and the communists wouldn't think anything about it. He's one of us, secretly. But he's actually not. He's a globalist who uses, and this is what conservatives have to learn, the globalists use communism to break down the social order. They are not communists. You know, my uncle wrote in his book, The Naked Communist, the 45 Goals of Communism, and it's broadcast all over the world, part of the congressional record. People all over Fox News sometimes talk about Cleon Skousen. Glenn Beck talks about Cleon Skousen's 45 Goals of Communism. But in fact, I knew that my uncle did not, in fact, get those strictly from the Communist Party. My uncle, who was a great patriot, he devised those by going through all the different material that the left and decided this is what they have to do to take over. And he's right. These are their goals. But the point is, only about a third of those goals were accomplished by communists in this country. 2/3 of them were accomplished by globalists who mesh and agree with those goals, like destroying the morality of people and engaging in promoting transgenderism and gays and other types of things. This is globalism. Now, the globalists like George Soros fund BLM and Antifa, don't they, which were formed by communists. Doesn't mean that George Soros is a communist. He's a globalist, but he's funding the communists to break down the social order so that you have an excuse to come in and resolve and give solutions that the public would not normally accept. So this is a very deceptive conspiracy we're dealing with, folks. You have to be very careful not to pick the obvious, that Soros must be a communist because he's funding communists. It's more sophisticated than that. Well, going back to World War II, George Catlett Marshall, who was in charge of the State Department during the Truman administration, told Chiang Kai-shek, who had been fighting Mao in the Civil War in China at the end of World War II, that you've got to join in a coalition government with Mao Zedong. And the State Department had done that in several other countries. That's how we lost Laos and Cambodia and all those, joining in a coalition government with the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek said, I'm not going to do that. I know what happens when you join in a coalition. They keep fighting, they keep arming, and eventually take us over. And so George Catlett Marshall says, well, if you don't, we cut off military aid to you. Now, if you read Wikipedia, which is a CIA operation, will tell you that Chiang Kai-shek lost the confidence of the soldiers because of his corruption, and that's why they defected and left his soldiers and walked away. They didn't say that they didn't have any arms or ammunition and that Mao Zedong and his army were being funded by the Soviets. That's the real reason. You'd walk away too if you didn't have any arms and ammunition. And then they went to Taiwan, or Formosa in those days, to start what is now Taiwan. So this is a pattern after World War II that will prevail. The globalists, and if you read my uncle's book, The Naked Communist, he'll talk about the second floor of the State Department, which is where the Latin American desk is. And that's where they were full of communists. And McCarthy was really worried about those communists in the State Department and tried to get rid of them. But the thing that I noticed in the book is that there's all these non-communists protecting them, keeping them from being fired in the Truman administration and the Roosevelt administration, people like Alger Hiss. The establishment defended Alger Hiss to his dying days. He spent, 60 years or something in prison for perjury. That's what they were able to get him on, not for being a communist, for being a traitor, but for perjury, for lying about something. But the establishment doesn't defend real communists like they defended Alger Hiss. It's because he was an establishment, saint to them. He was a globalist. And that's why they defended Alger Hiss so much. One of the reasons they hated Richard Nixon, by the way, and pulled the Watergate thing on him, they were all CIA, deep state people who went in and betrayed Nixon in the Watergate thing. Remember, parties spy on each other every time. You get one president for spying, well, you could get every president, for spying on things. But all of the people were dirty tricks people out of the CIA that went into the Watergate Hotel and then leaked it to Woodward and Associates in the media. But the reason the establishment hated Nixon was because, guess what? He was the prosecutor of Alger Hiss. He's the one who sent him to prison. So even though he became president, the globalists never forgave Richard Nixon. They had a grudge match against it for putting Alger Hiss in prison, and that's what they did to him. And what was sad was that Richard Nixon spent the rest of his life trying to play up to the globalists. After he got ousted from office, he spoke at every globalist conference, the World Federalists, and he tried to get back in their good graces. Very sad case, very sad case. Well, going back to World War II, or in the interim period after the World War, we brought, that is the globalists in the State Department, brought Castro to power by cutting off military aid to Batista. We brought the Sandinistas to power by cutting off military aid to Somoza, the most pro-Western, well-educated at military schools, spoke fluent English, and was not the ruthless dictator that he was painted at. And in fact, we have two books. They're great books. They ought to be in your library. One is called Dagger in the Heart, Foreign Policy Failures in Cuba, by Mario Lazo, L-A-Z-O. He was the fluent in English Spanish attorney, worked with the United States as a liaison with Cuba, all during the Batista years. Now, he knew that Batista did have his corruption problems, but he documents everything he did to try to get the State Department to stop funding Castro secretly through CIA black ops and destroying Batista. And he documents everything that happened. He even talked to Eisenhower personally, Mario Lazo did. And Eisenhower then talked to his handler, which was his brother Milton, and Milton talked him into betraying Batista. But even the more documented case is Anastasio Somoza and Jax Cox. They wrote the book Nicaragua Betrayed. And boy, you talk about documentation. He's got the telephone conversations with all the people in the state, promising them, then betraying him. Everything that he tried to do is just incredible, the story. It will just bring tears to your eyes. And then they promised him protection if he would leave Nicaragua voluntarily, and he did. And then they kicked him out of Miami into Paraguay, where I used to live. In Paraguay, he was then assassinated by the left. And the U.S. kicked him out of Miami specifically so that he could be killed by the left in Paraguay. This is the kind of history that we're dealing with. This is the stuff you never learn in high school. This is the stuff you never hear in Fox News. This is the history of the deep state. Now, during the Nixon administration, we found out later after he was ousted that Henry Kissinger kept him through his White House doctor on mood-altering drugs almost the entire presidency so that he'd be easily manipulated. And in one of those sessions, he was able to talk Nixon into everything, including giving the Soviets the miniature ball-bearing technology they needed to create the miniature gyros to guide multiple warheads in nuclear missiles to separate targets. That's called MIRVing your warhead, multiple independent reentry vehicles, MIRV, M-I-R-V. The Russians only had one warhead per missile up until that time. And Kissinger talked him into giving them the main company ball-bearing technology so they could make these gyros, because just like enriched uranium, they couldn't do it, and they couldn't make miniature gyros for the lack of a little miniature ball bearing. Isn't that interesting? As the Soviets have always depended on, according to Anthony Sutton and the communists, of Western technology. And that's why China has had to steal all the plans to almost all of our fighters, and that's why they look alike. That's why the Russian aircraft look alike to our aircraft. That was Richard Nixon, but that was Henry Kissinger. And then came along the Vietnam War. Now, I was there during that period, and I'll tell you, it was our own government that sabotaged that war. Our squadron told us when they came back from Vietnam, they couldn't arm their missiles until a missile was on the rails toward them, and they were having to maneuver against it. We weren't allowed to hit their missile batteries until late in the war. We weren't allowed to mine the harbor. You could fly aircraft over and drop mines in the harbor so that the Russian and Chinese couldn't resupply North Vietnam. And we were refused to do that. We had safe areas for the communists right across to the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia that you couldn't touch, you couldn't bomb, just like in the Korean War, which was a UN operation, by the way. You couldn't touch anything across the Yalu River, which separated Red China from North Korea. And of course, the head of UN military operations was always a Soviet general. So everything US operations had to approve through the UN went through a Soviet general and immediately got telegraphed to Pyongyang and Beijing. And that's why we lost the war. Now, the only reason the Incheon landing worked for MacArthur is that he didn't tell the UN what he was going to do. And that's why it was a surprise. And that cut the entire continent in half. And as soon as we had chased all the Chinese northward, they called truce. And that's why we have a truce today that divides North and South Korea. MacArthur was not allowed to win the war, was not allowed to push them all the way back to China. That's the way no-win wars work. And so, coming up to Vietnam, you might ask yourself, why is it that our own government sabotaged the war in Vietnam? Do you notice in Vietnam there are no yellow ribbons to support our troops? None of that. You couldn't walk into an airport and someone would say, thank you for your service. It didn't happen during Vietnam. They'd spit on you. And that's because the globalists wanted to poison the American minds against ever protecting another country against communism. That's what happened in Vietnam. We've never protected another nation against communism since Vietnam. When did the yellow ribbons come out? When did the support our troops come out? When we had, after 9/11, when we invaded innocent countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, claiming that they were harboring Osama bin Laden, that they were part of 9/11. Well, I'm here to tell you that 9/11 was a deep state operation from beginning to end. Terrorists had nothing to do with it except being hired out of Saudi Arabia to pretend to learn to fly, to pretend to capture and fly airliners. Well, I'm here to tell you, and Randy will back me up, if you fly a sophisticated aircraft with an autopilot and you learned on a Cessna, you wouldn't even know how to turn off the autopilot and take control of an airplane, let alone program the navigation computer to get you back and find your way back to New York. And you'd say, well, maybe they just flew out to the coast and then flew south, but that's not the way it is. It's a straight beeline for New York City and a crash right into the World Trade Center. How did that happen with people who couldn't even pass a Cessna flight lesson? It's impossible. It's because there were uninterruptible autopilots on those airplanes. That technology had been developed in order to stop hijacking, meaning you had two autopilots in the aircraft. One was uninterruptible that would take control away from the other autopilot. These can only be done with fly-by-wire aircraft that are controlled by electronics, not by cables. You don't move the controls in modern airplanes with cables. You talk to a computer and it moves the controls through hydraulics. And so it's very easy to control the airplane with autopilots because you just talk to the computer. Well, so the pilot has an autopilot, he learns, but they didn't know that these aircraft now had uninterruptible autopilots on them. And you could turn any airliner into a drone and take possession of it, and that's what happened. In fact, you now have the evidence that the cockpit door on those hijacked aircraft was never opened. So how did the hijackers get into the cockpit and take control if the cockpit door, which is electronically alarmed, was never open? Uninterruptible autopilots. But that's not all. Two of the airplanes were switched over the Midwest with two drone aircraft, 757 specially modified, that came from the West Coast. And you see them on the, I'm part of Pilots for 9/11 Truth. We have the radar tapes, got those out of the government through an FOIA demand and a court order. You see these two aircraft, one from Boston Logan and one from Dulles, Flight 77, that supposedly hit the Pentagon, rendezvous with these two others, circle around them, and the two aircraft that took off from the East Coast went on west, and these other two from the West Coast went on, and one of them hit the World Trade Center, the South Tower. Remember, it hit second. And you remember, if you see the videos, it banks hard to make sure it doesn't miss the tower, and you see this big bulge on the bottom of the fuselage. How many remember that? The big bulge on the fuselage, and of course the media says, oh, there's no bulge, that's just the landing gear where it goes up. No, this was a big bulge. In fact, I called Boeing, because in our squadron, where we had aircraft from Lockheed Martin, McDonnell Douglas, every change that you'd make to that aircraft had to be approved by the manufacturer. So I called Boeing, who makes the 757, and I said, who authorized these modifications on the aircraft? And I expected them to say, what modification? We deny there's any modification. But that's not what they said. They said, we didn't do it. We didn't do it. That's the manufacturer acknowledging that the bulge was there, and they didn't do it. No, that was done in the Skunk Works, probably in Area 51 or something like that, who has all that. They have a whole aircraft manufacturing. That's where the stealth fighter, the 117, was created out of Area 51. So they have whole manufacturing facilities there. I think that's where the modification was done, and to Flight 77, or the drone that replaced it. And why did that? You see, those two aircraft had to be modified. They couldn't have just been flown into the towers like the first aircraft that did in Flight 93. Those were controlled remotely by uninterruptible autopilots. But Flight 77 had a couple of major modifications, huge. The terrorists, I wrote a brief about a month ago about 99 things the terrorists could not have done in 9/11, including loading the buildings with explosives, including shutting down the two Twin Towers on the weekend before 9/11, which was on a Tuesday. Both towers were completely shut down, everybody locked out, and that's when they were wiring up the final triggering mechanisms for the explosive charges. Terrorists couldn't have shut down. They couldn't have given the orders. The terrorists couldn't have changed all the insurance into a $1 billion policy and changed ownership. Terrorists couldn't have loaded them in explosives in Building 7, which came down obviously by controlled demolition. And they couldn't have modified these aircraft. And Flight 77 hit the Pentagon was a real special aircraft because it had a missile under the wing. There was a missile under the wing. And it was also loaded plane and wing to tail, tip to tail, and with explosives. And I'll show you how we know that. because of the parking lot video, when you see that airplane coming in right low to the ground, and I've shot missiles, I know what a missile coming off an aircraft looks like, and you see the smoke plume, whew, like that. And then you don't see the missile, you see the smoke trail, and then boom, the Pentagon explodes with what? A white flash, and then red and black smoke. Now, when an airplane full of fuel hits a wall like that, if it doesn't have explosives, it's just red and black. That's what diesel fuel, or kerosene looks like when it explodes. But there was a big white flash there. That's high explosives. And that's why the military people, when they came out of the Pentagon, said, we smell cordite. Cordite is the explosive material of plastic explosives. Now, there was one witness that saw and made an accurate description of what happened to Flight 77 when it hit the Pentagon. Now, remember the Pentagon wall where that hit had just been completely redone and reinforced, highly reinforced, double thickness, highly reinforced concrete. Why did they do that? Well, we'll see, but that's why they needed a missile, because there were sensitive things going on, including the investigation on the lost $3 trillion that the Pentagon was supposedly investigating, and that wanted to be destroyed. A lot of sensitive stuff was going on in the Pentagon where it was destroyed. But the proof that there was a missile on there was not only the explosive signature of that first thing, which can only be high explosives, but that the fact that there were 3 12-foot consecutive holes in 3 rings of the Pentagon. Now, an aircraft is soft aluminum, and it might make a hole in the first wall, except that it was reinforced, but it's not going to make a perfect 12-foot hole in the second ring and the third ring of the Pentagon. Now, there's additional proof. Listed among the debris inside the first ring of the Pentagon is half of a radome of that 757. Half of a radome. Now, if that wall was intact when that airplane hit it, how many pieces would be of that fiberglass radome? You know what the radome is? That's the nose cone of the aircraft. It wouldn't be anything that you could find. It would be dust. If half of the radome is in there, that means there was a hole in that wall. And that's why there's only one landing gear from the left wing in the wall and nothing else. But where's the rest of the airplane then if it didn't go through into the airplane? Well, that's where the movie, remember there was this movie about no airplane hit the Pentagon. There's all kinds of false conspiracy theories. But in fact, the lawn and the parking lot was littered with confetti-sized pieces of aluminum. And one witness saw what happened. His name was Ben Nayanara. And he was parked in the stop as everyone stopped to see this airplane come in. And he said the airplane crashed in the Pentagon wall and crumpled up, and the wall held up like a champ. Wall held up like a champ, he said, and then the plane exploded and disappeared. Now let me tell you, if there's a bomb in the baggage compartment of an airliner, there's going to be a lot of big pieces. Not going to affect the wings, not going to affect the engines, it's going to blow the tail off, it's going to leave most of the fuselage intact. But the biggest piece was about 3 feet long with part of an A for American Airlines on it. That plane had to be loaded with nose to tail and wingtip to wingtip with explosives, which the terrorists could not have done. How do you get access to an airplane like that? And you talk about the bulge on the airplane. That couldn't have been Flight 11 from Boston Logan, because the co-pilot has to do a walk around an airliner before he accepts it, before he climbs into the cockpit with the pilot. If he'd noted that big bulge practically dragging to the ground, he'd say, what's this? He wouldn't have accepted that airplane. That was modified, and that was a drone that came in. Now, so that airplane that hit the Pentagon was just a completely revised aircraft. Besides, it did a 5G turn at over 500 miles an hour, which is structurally supposed to be impossible. And every airline pilot I've talked about could never do that turn, let alone a person who couldn't even get a Cessna pilot's license. No, that was a drone that was doing that. So that's the story with 9/11, which gave us the war on terror, which I call the phony war on terror. Now, what you don't know is that the war on terror was prepared in advance. Secretary of the Treasury O'Neill during the George W. Bush administration said, I was at a meeting in August and they were planning on invading Iraq and Afghanistan, but they said, we need an excuse to do so. And that's what the PNAC report was, Project for the New American Century. We need a new Pearl Harbor to create American dominance. And all of those neocons that you hear about, which are globalists in sheep's clothing, and they're Democrats. Neocons are not conservatives, by the way. They come from the Democratic Party, and they switched Republican to boost this patriotic militarism among conservatives you've all bought into. Thank you for your service. Well, I'll tell you, if you're working in Afghanistan and Iraq, you're not defending our freedoms. Now, you may think you are, but you're actually dealing with a globalist agenda. When we invaded Libya, that was what really started the attacks that led to the war on terror. Remember the Libya attack where we had a no-fly zone? Everybody could fly but us. I mean, nobody could fly but the West. And we went in and destroyed his army, shot up his military on the ground. And we eventually killed Muammar Gaddafi, who was the closest thing probably to a benevolent dictator that there is. Now, I don't mean that he wasn't necessarily a good moral person, but at least he gave most of his oil wealth back to the people. Free hospital care, free schools, free this and that. Sure, it's a socialist government, and you can't do that, in a normal economy unless you've got oodles of oil. But that's what he did. But they destroyed Muammar Gaddafi to create a jihadist revolution in Libya. And it happened in Tunisia, too, next door. And what did they do with those jihadists? They imported them into Syria because Syria was going to be the next target after Libya. Why Syria? Because the U.S. intelligence knew that Iraq took all of their chemical weapons out of Syria. Remember the weapons of mass destruction that Secretary of State talked about on television, that we've got to invade Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction? Well, they didn't have a nuclear program, but they did have chemical weapons. But the Russians provided a whole convoy of trucks and took all of the chemical weapons out of Iraq and moved them into Syria. So we knew that Bashar al-Assad had chemical weapons. Now, Bashar al-Assad is the UK-educated ophthalmologist, speaks fluent English, is married to an English woman, who's not like his father, Hafez al-Assad, who was a tyrant, who did torture for the CIA, by the way. That's how the deep state operates. But Bashar al-Assad inherited a deep state organization from his father when his father died, and he wasn't a deep state person. So he started to reform the country. But the U.S. decided we're going to take Syria for their own globalist purpose, and I'll explain what those are, based on the fact that he had chemical weapons. So when they started to mount this civil war, which wasn't a civil war, it was imported jihadists, which they created by the invasion of Libya and Tunisia, Bashar said, what have I done? And the West says, well, you've got chemical weapons, and that's why we're going to invade. And he said, well, come and get them. I don't want them. And that threw a curveball to the globalists. One of the globalist secretaries, I forgot his name, he was in Europe right now, and he about had a fit when he heard what Bashar al-Assad said, because the media asked him, what are you going to do now? I don't know what we're going to do now. Well, that's when they really imported most of the jihadists after he said, come and get the weapons, we don't want them, and created this civil war. Well, then what happened, this is post 9/11, all of a sudden, about a year into that civil war, something happened. Something came out of nowhere that nobody had ever heard about. It's called ISIS. Remember when ISIS was created? Did any of you ever think, what's this ISIS? We know about Al-Qaeda, we know about these jihadists, the civil war, and what's ISIS? It suddenly came out, and they had all these orange jumpsuits. Remember, they were going to behead these people, these journalists, etc. They were just ruthless people, and they had all these white Toyota pickup trucks. Suddenly, there were hundreds of them. Where did this come from? Well, the media didn't ask any of those questions, but I found out. The deep state who created ISIS basically took 50% of the jihadists that they'd imported from Libya and gave them a name change, called them ISIS, and gave them priority on funding totally funded by the U.S. deep state through black market weapons. That was found out by the Romanian journalist Dilyana Detansheva, who infiltrated one of ISIS's warehouses and found all these shipping documents from the U.S., proving that the U.S. was supplying arms for ISIS. And what did they do with ISIS? Did they attack Syria? No. They sent them on a rampage into Iraq. But what are Muslims, jihadists, attacking other Muslims for? Did you ever wonder about that? And so Iraq was saying, in fact, they were blowing the whistle on this because they had these big weapons depots that they had discovered out in the west desert of Iraq, and they were calling the U.S. and saying, what's going on? What are these weapons out here? And sure enough, those were for ISIS. So ISIS invades Iraq, takes all of those weapons, and starts to then create chaos in Iraq and tension between the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds. And that was one of the globalist purposes for the entire war on terror, to create millions of refugees of Muslims. And where did they send them? To Europe. And now Europe is 25% Muslim, and Belgium is 60% Muslim. Now, you see, that's conflict creation. That's chaos. That's where you then have changed all of the politics in Europe. Remember, Angela Merkel, who's, by the way, a former communist, Chancellor of Germany, letting in all these refugees, and then they finally oust her because they're just so upset about all these refugees and what has happened. And she's replaced by Olaf Scholz, another former communist from East Germany. Now, it's like Tony Blair was a Marxist, became the leader of the Tories, not the Tories, but the Labour Party in Britain. So you never know with these formative communists whether they've actually repented or they become bought off and become globalists. I think the latter. I think they bought off. That's what happened to Barack Obama, by the way. Remember, he was a communist organizer in Chicago, made about $60,000 a year, and then suddenly they ran him for Senate in Chicago, and he became wealthy, and now he's worth $14 to $20 million. Now, how do you do that on a $60,000 a year salary? 2 mansions in Chicago, $14 million property in Hawaii. On Martha's Vineyard has another $10 million property. That's what happens when you join forces with the globalists. They don't do that for communists, real communists. So you got to look past the fact. And by the way, Barack Obama is not running the puppet Biden administration. A lot of conservatives said Barack Obama was a puppet just like Biden. More intelligent perhaps, but he was watching football most of the time until he got his briefings when he was president. He wasn't running the presidency. And he's not running the Biden administration. There's 4 or 5 handlers that they have now. And every puppet president has a handler. And I can name most of them. Eisenhower had the Milton brothers and the Dulles brothers, Milton Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers. And so they were there during the Kennedy administration, but it was McGeorge Bundy that was his real handler. JFK went to bed on the night of the Bay of Pigs, having authorized the air support for the Bay of Pigs. And in the night, while JFK was asleep, McGeorge Bundy canceled it. And JFK was livid the next morning when he got up. And he vowed then, I'm going to break the FBI covert operations. And that sealed his death warrant. That you go up against the deep state. Now, JFK was not a conservative president. He knew that his father had mafia connections and had tweaked the election in order to get him elected, barely over Richard Nixon. But still, he thought he was president. He did not act as a puppet. And he actually acted as president. And he tried to get through a full socialist program, which failed. And that's one of the second reasons why they killed him, for the martyr effect. Because you see, a socialist program was going nowhere until they killed him. And then they named highways and airports and everything after Kennedy. And then everything he put forth in Congress passed under Lyndon B. Johnson in the Great Society legislation. That was all Kennedy stuff. Well, his son, John Kennedy, was pretty savvy about a lot of these things, and that's why they killed him. You know, that aircraft that supposedly went down in poor visibility. No, there was an attorney on the beach that day that heard the explosion. They put a bomb on that aircraft. That's what they killed. They didn't want another Kennedy running, and that's what is the problem with Robert F. Kennedy. He's waking up. Now, the Kennedy family is still out to lunch and liberal and democratic. They don't like Robert F. Kennedy. But Robert F. Kennedy knows about at least a portion of conspiracy to make him very, very dangerous, as I've said, to the establishment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to finish up one thing about Vietnam relative to Henry Kissinger. You know, we finally did a bombing campaign on Hanoi that brought Hanoi to its knees. Hanoi came to the Paris peace talks willing to negotiate heavily and not surrender, but they came to capitulate a lot of their demands because they couldn't tolerate the bombing of Hanoi. It was destroying the city. That was our B-52 bombers, just night and day, tons of bombs on Hanoi. So what did Henry Kissinger do, who under Richard Nixon ran the negotiations? He first of all told the North Vietnamese, we'll have a peace treaty, we'll have a ceasefire, you can take back South Vietnam, but give us 3 years before you do so. And it was almost 3 years to the day when North Vietnamese reinvaded Vietnam and created that great travesty. And then he did something that had nothing to do with the war in Vietnam. He agreed to oust Taiwan out of the seat in the UN and replace it with Red China and give them a seat on the Security Council with veto power. Now, why would you do that? Here's the country that tortured our prisoners. And the Soviet Union took a lot of our prisoners from Vietnam and put them under medical experimentation and torture in the Soviet Union, which is documented in a book that I've read. But Red China was the real evil one. They're the ones that were shipping most of the supplies in there and supplying all of the arms and the technology, and even had some Chinese troops in Vietnam. And we gave them a seat on the UN, ousting Taiwan, with a seat on the Security Council. You know, when the UN was formed, they gave the Soviet Union 3 seats on the Security Council with veto power. Why would you do that? Because you're globalists, and you want to use communists to create conflict and to make the UN ineffective. Why do they want the UN to be ineffective? So eventually, another war will give a call for a UN with teeth. You see, and that's where we're headed. The globalists have been funding. Remember, they built the Bolsheviks, they brought them to power, they armed the Soviet Union, they made them a nuclear power, they brought Mao Zedong to power, and they've allowed China to steal technology for years. And then another Republican, Newt Gingrich, who convinced America in his contract with America to make him Speaker of the House, what was his first act of Congress as Speaker? To give Red China most favored trading status. And then eventually to get him into the World Trade Organization. So that what? We could give them all of our business. And this had 2 purposes. One, the United States was inflating the currency at about the rate of about 10%, saying it was 1 to 2%. They always fudge the CPI because we do have one form of indexing in the U.S., and that's the Social Security cost of living allowance. COLA. How many are you on Social Security? 2 years ago, when you had high inflation, did you get a COLA? Cost of living allowance? No. They said no, there was no inflation. Oh, it's incredible. They finally gave us a COLA last year when it was 15% of inflation. They gave us a 3% increase. That's because the CPI is always understated by about 3 times in order to not have hyperinflation. Our government knows what indexing does, but Social Security is the only indexing, and that's why they fudge the numbers on that. So Newt Gingrich gave us these things, and this is what has built Red China. We have given them the money to be able to buy all those goods. And of course, one of the conditions of doing business with China, you have to give them all of your technology. But that wasn't all. Our Commerce Department has been controlled by the globalists ever since the Ronald Reagan administration. It was during the Reagan administration that we gave away a ton of military technology, dual-use technology, that the Commerce Department approved and said, yeah, it's okay because China is an ally now so that we don't have to restrict the technology to China. It was during the Reagan administration that used aircraft, and I had a subscriber that was part of used aircraft, and he complained to me. He said, you know, we got the Chinese running all over the place, looking over our shoulders. I said, well, have you protested to management? And he wrote back a week later and said, yeah, we protested, and we threatened to strike if they didn't throw the Chinese out. And what did the management do? They kicked us out on Saturdays and let the Chinese have the run of the entire plant. That was what is happening during the Reagan administration. Now, did Reagan do that? No. Did he know that? No. But Ronald Reagan made a severe compromise in order to become president. He beat George H.W. Bush for the president, for the nomination. And then the three heads of the media came to him, CBS, ABC, and NBC, and says, you know, Mr. President nominee, we can either look with favor on your presidency or we can destroy you in the media. We would look with favor if you took George H.W. Bush as your vice president and let him control personnel in the White House. And Reagan agreed to that. And he still fought that all the time, and that's why they tried to assassinate him. And after they assassinated him, he became much more compliant. In fact, he and Nancy turned to Gene Dixon, another spiritualist, to try to get some kind of spiritual protection because of the assassination. But the Reagan White House was full of homosexuals during that time, brought in by George H.W. Bush, and that's why Reagan was fighting tooth and nail to get what he did. And Reagan made some major mistakes. We had the biggest tax increase in history during the Reagan administration, 15% Social Security increase. We had the first amnesty of illegal aliens during that, and we had the first law that made vaccine manufacturers immune from lawsuits over damage during the Reagan administration. So while Reagan was one of the only two presidents in the modern times that has not been a puppet president, Reagan and Trump, both of them have made serious errors because they were not prepared for the conspiratorial forces mounted against them. And so that's how China now has become a major enemy, is that we have built it. And that's my theme today, is that globalists have built these enemies because they need one more war. World War II gave us the UN, but no teeth, no regulatory power, no taxation power, no military power, no police power. And we pay most of the bills voluntarily. They need one more war to get us into a militarized global government. And that's why they built Russia and China. Those are going to be the part of World War III, and we're going to face that probably within 3 to 5 years. You're going to live to see it, almost every one of you in this audience. Are you prepared? I don't think you are. Now, the government is preparing night and day for this. New bunker systems being driven into the ground in the West Desert of Utah and other places, because they know the Soviets and the Chinese know where all their others are, in Washington, D.C., and et cetera. They've even got some bunker systems under skyscrapers in Washington, D.C. We found that out in the bomb scare of the Capitol, and they all went scurrying over to one skyscraper and went into the basement. There was a whole bunker, and several media people found out about it. There's one under the vice president's residence at the National Observatory. The neighbors there, when I was there in Washington in the 1980s, were complaining about all these explosions going off underground, and the government finally had to admit they were building a big bunker system under the Naval Observatory for the vice president. Except the American people are not being warned that you need to have safe places and you need to have things. That's one of the reasons why I've dedicated the other half of my career to helping people to prepare. And I'm no hypocrite, I'm prepared myself. Move to safer places, have retreats, have safe rooms, and have underground facilities and stockpiles and things. And that's a problem because I'm a known entity, as a known pioneer in the preparedness movement. And so I can't afford to be around when mobs come knocking at my door when they run out of food. And that's the problem. It's sad to say, but if you start to share, you might as well not prepare, because you'll be starving within 2 weeks like everybody else. So you have to do things in private, and that's why you need underground safe rooms and things to conceal these things. Not only from government, but from roving mobs, because this world war is going to be preceded by an EMP strike. Only Russia and China can throw an EMP strike. It takes 8 or 9 nuclear EMP weapons in the high atmosphere to take down the grid. So forget about Iran or North Korea, it takes Russia or China. And they're going to do it 15 to 20 minutes probably before they strike the military. It's my analysis that they're not going to strike cities per se, but they're going to strike only military bases and missile bases so that they can blackmail the West into submission. They don't want to destroy the infrastructure, they want to take over. General Hao Tian of China in 2011 gave a major speech that was leaked to the Epoch Times saying, we're going to take over North and South America, we're going to cleanse the people with biological weapons, and because we need living space. We've run out of agriculture space in China. You know, China can't feed itself. They import almost a third of their food, a lot of it from the US. We feed China. But they need living space. And Hao Tian says, we're not going to be nice like the Nazis were. We're going to be ruthless. Now, they've been trying to design a biological weapon that will hit Caucasians but not Asians, so that they can strike us and it won't bite them back. They haven't been able to do so. They've been dovetailing with Israel, who's been trying to do something that will attack Arabs but not Jews. And it's not going to work. That's why China's gone back to nuclear weapons, because they haven't been able to get a cleansing bioweapon. But I'll tell you, our own government's working. You know, there's over 150 biolabs our government runs around the world. That's how evil this is today. Yes, there are 7 labs in Ukraine. But what the mainstream media or what the conservatives don't tell you, who are using that as an argument about not defending Ukraine, Ukraine is corrupt. This is going to bring me to the major point of contention with conservatives. I am the only journalist in the United States that blew the whistle on the fact that the Soviets faked their own demise. Communism just went underground. They faked their own demise. There was one other journalist in the UK, Christopher Story, who did the same thing. He and I eventually collaborated, but he called the fall of the Soviet Union fake as well. And the proof is there. In fact, Putin even admitted that to Tucker Carlson in his interview with him in Moscow. He said, and I quote, the Russian leadership effectively initiated the fall of the Soviet Union. Tucker didn't blink an eye. He didn't understand what he was hearing. He didn't remember that the official narrative is that it was an uprising from the ground up that the Soviets couldn't control. Remember that? Students in Leipzig began to protest. Students in Moscow and Red Square began to protest. But there's a backstory to it. Where were the Stasi when the students were protesting in Leipzig? The protesters never dared protest before because they knew the Stasi was watching, and they had tried and had been arrested. But Erich Honecker on his deathbed, the dictator of East Germany, said, Moscow gave me orders to have the Stasi stand down and let the student riots or protests in Leipzig go forward. Same thing happened with the KGB. They were told to stand down so they didn't arrest anybody in Red Square when they were listening to Yeltsin on that tank talking about democracy. And the television station that was broadcasting Yeltsin's message to the whole Russian world was still run by the communists. Why didn't they pull the plug? Because it was a fake thing. Now, Putin told another lie to Tucker Carlson. He said, why did we do this? Why did we pull down the Soviet Union? Because we wanted peace with the West and cooperation. Now, that was a lie, too. The reason they did it was to get aid and trade because they were falling behind in the arms race. You know, and conservatives have been told, Ronald Reagan told Gorbachev to tear down this wall, and he did, and we applaud Reagan, destroyed the Soviet Union, but he didn't. It was a fool's errand. They gave credit to Reagan so that you would buy into it. It's one of the 3 major deceptions in the world. Global conspiracies. The fall of the Soviet Union, the fake fall of the Soviet Union, that 9/11 was a terrorist attack. Those are the 3 worldwide conspiracies that most everybody in the world has bought into. You shouldn't be one of them. But I have outlined in the March 3rd, 2023, the entire reasons, about 14 of them that prove that the Soviet Unions faked their own demise, including the Gorbachev coup. Remember when the KGB attempted to capture Gorbachev in his undefended villa? Well, they had 4 or 5 bodyguards, and they failed. Since when has the KGB failed when they've overthrown whole governments? But that wasn't the really interesting point. It's that the media announced that the heads of the KGB, the GRU, and the defense minister were fleeing for their lives after the failed coup. And not a single media personality asked, who were they fleeing from? That was the first question I asked. Well, who does the KGB flee from? Who does the GRU flee from? Who does the defense minister flee from if they're really the defense minister? Well, they were puppets that were put in there. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the real powers behind Gorbachev and the Politburo came forth, and that was Boris Berezovsky and the others who became oligarchs. Now, how did they become oligarchs? Who was Boris Berezovsky? Nobody knew. He was behind the scenes. How did he become wealthy? Because these were the real communist leaders, and they had the power to tell the state bank of the Soviet Union to lend us the money to buy Gazprom and the oil industry and the other media outlets. That's how they got the money. They were known as the real communist leaders to the state bank, and that's how they got the loans. And so they brought Yeltsin to power as a puppet president. He was a drunk most of the time. He just did what they told him to do. Until they brought Vladimir Putin on board. They needed someone stronger to handle the world situation. Spanish intelligence said that Vladimir Putin met with Boris Berezovsky in his Spanish villa 5 times the year before he ascended to the presidency. Now that was proof that Boris Berezovsky was the head honcho and that he was getting his marching orders before Vladimir Putin became president. And then when Vladimir Putin became president 2 years later, he had Boris Berezovsky killed in London. He had Grudzinski, another oligarch, exiled to Israel. He had Khodorkovsky, head of all the oil concessions, jailed. He took down all the original other oligarchs and established new ones. And rumor is on the street that they have to give him 4% of their ill-gotten gains, which makes Putin the wealthiest man in the world. So that gold-plated palace in Sochi where the Winter Olympics were, that belongs to Putin. That's how corruption works. So don't believe that Putin is a Christian. Don't believe that he's anti-woke. He's not for the Soviet Union. I mean, he's not for gays and transgenders in the Soviet Union. He didn't want to corrupt his own people. But the Communist Party is still pushing all that stuff in the United States. So you can't believe that Vladimir Putin is anti-woke. Most conservatives have bought into this because of one thing. In the phony war on terror, we went after countries that were innocent. Afghanistan had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden. In fact, Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with the 9/11. He was working for the CIA. In fact, they had 2 lookalikes to Osama bin Laden that did those videos taking credit for 9/11. And they killed one of those lookalikes in Abbottabad, Pakistan, in the phony claim that they killed Osama bin Laden to give credit to Obama. That's why they dumped his body in the ocean, so they wouldn't have any evidence and DNA. And that's why they ended up killing a lot of SEAL Team 6 members in Afghanistan in a helicopter crash, so they couldn't talk about it. Well, this is a mixed up world, ladies and gentlemen. I want to impress upon you the fact that this is a very evil world, and it's already too far gone to resurrect. You're not going to see your country ever be free again. This stuff is embedded deep within the country, and they're going to bring war upon you. And they're going to steal the election from Donald Trump. Now, I was really surprised when they brought out Joe Biden to run against Trump in 2020, because he was getting senile even then. And you notice he was in his basement he never campaigned. Did you notice that? Biden never campaigned. So why do that? You know, are they arrogant enough to say we could put any puppet up there, we could put a gorilla up there and elect him, that's how much power we have? because that's the way it worked out. And they surrounded him with all of these handlers, etc. And you know, after the disastrous debate, and the debate, prior to the debate, you notice you never heard a criticism in the media about Joe Biden. It was all over the alternative media about him stopping in the middle of speech, staring for 30 seconds. And the media would never show those clips, right? Because the word went out to the media, which is totally controlled by the deep state, the mainstream media. You never, ever showcase Biden's senility or weakness. That was the law, okay? But when that debate happened, this panel, which were all pro-Biden liberals, except for one token rhino Republican, they said, or they gave a mild criticism of Biden's debate performance. I mean, it was disastrous, but they gave a mild criticism. What they didn't realize, they opened the floodgates. Suddenly, all the other liberals who knew about the gag order, you never do, said, oh, the gag order must be off. So we're free to now say we want someone other than Biden. It became an avalanche. And what did the deep state do? Did they give in and give up on Biden? Did they? Not initially. They kept pushing for Biden. Biden's going to run. He's going to debate Trump. He's going to do it. And then it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and finally, they gave up on Biden, and I thought, you know, and I said in the World First Brief, you know, they don't like Kamala Harris. I mean, she's an idiot. She can't make a coherent sentence on her own. She had to be removed from all of vice president responsibilities, the border czar, et cetera, because she was incapable of it. And then they picked Kamala Harris, and suddenly by acclamation, not a vote, you know, she's going to be the nominee. And I thought, what are they doing? Even Gavin Newsom said, they told me to tell everybody it was a democratic process, but everybody knows it wasn't. Because Gavin Newsom wanted to be the nominee, and so did the governor of Michigan, who's fairly charismatic. Radical as hell, but charismatic. And yet with semi-competent people verbally, they picked Kamala Harris, the cackling witch. You know, why is the deep state doing that? Well, I thought with Biden, and I hypothesized, you know, Biden is really only good to them as a martyr. Maybe they want to push Biden in there because they're going to kill him and blame it on the Trump supporters, and that's how they go after you as domestic terrorists. Blame all the MAGA people as evil people because they killed the president. Remember, the martyr syndrome is very real. They do that. That's what they did to Martin Luther King. You know, Martin Luther King was a serial adulterer. He's with prostitutes almost every night. He was having an orgy with his entire staff and women in that motel in Memphis the day he came out on the balcony and got shot. They killed him for the martyr effect because he was going to get exposed. There was no way to keep it. Even at his Nobel Prize ceremony, he was with Norwegian prostitutes, Swedish prostitutes all night. So this was Martin Luther King. But what did they do? They kill him, and suddenly he's a martyr. Now he's a national hero. Right? You have to celebrate this. Well, I won't say what he is, but when I was in Washington, I asked Patrick Gray, who was the assistant to J. Edgar Hoover, what's in those 15 file cabinets they stashed away in the National Archives to keep us from knowing about Martin Luther King? And he said, well, I'm not allowed to tell you what's in them, but I can tell you generally 8 of those file cabinets are all the tape recordings and things filming we did about him with prostitutes. 8 file cabinets full. And 3 of them are about his communist connections. Now you know why they want it hidden away. Now you know why they want the JFK assassination files stuffed away for 50 years. And that 50 years came due during Barack Obama, and he didn't release them. No surprise there. Donald Trump says, I'm going to release those files, and he didn't do it. He told Fox News why, or not Fox News, he told Judge Napolitano why. He said, Mike Pompeo came to me, the former CIA director and Secretary of State, and said, you don't want to do this, Mr. Trump. He said, it will destroy the reputation of the United States if you open those files. And they told him certain things to convince him. And Judge Napolitano said, well, what did he tell you? He says, I can't tell you. I'm sworn to secrecy. Well, you see, the problem with that is that Donald Trump doesn't have the conspiratorial background that I do. He wouldn't know whether Mike Pompeo was telling him a lie or telling the truth. Now, I happen to know that the CIA hired mafia hitmen on the grassy knoll to shoot with high-powered rifles at Donald Trump. I mean, at JFK. It hit him in the neck first and then blew his head off. And then he had an autopsy before he even got to Bethesda, where they removed all those bullet fragments so that the real autopsy, or the official autopsy, wouldn't show them. The autopsy technician was carrying the x-rays across the balcony of the rotunda when Jackie Kennedy came in with Jack Kennedy's coffin. Well, that was an empty coffin. He had the x-rays of the body. There's all kinds of things that you can learn about conspiracy in the deep state if you study these things. But Donald Trump has never studied conspiracy. But going back to Kamala Harris, you know, suddenly they said she's 4 points ahead of Donald Trump. Now, her reputation was even lower than Biden before that. And suddenly she's 4 points higher than Donald Trump. Well, you know how they falsify the polls. They tell, well, we had 900 people that we polled. Well, they got a computer full of people that they polled in the past. They know exactly how they think. And they say, well, we let the computer pick randomly. Well, I don't believe that. I think they say, well, I want this particular result, and the computer picks enough to get that result. It happens every time. That's how this polling is done. That's why they don't do exit polling anymore at elections. Remember when college students used to ask you as you leave the poll, who did you vote for? And that stuff was pretty accurate. Well, I covered the details in the November issue of World Affairs Brief, November 20th, about how we know how many votes were stolen from Donald Trump, because somebody hacked into Edison Research database. Who's Edison Research? They're the ones that feed all the television stations the election information on election night. KSL, KUTV, downtown Dallas, Houston, every station gets it from Edison Research. Someone hacked into the computer and they saw how many votes came in for Donald Trump and didn't yet applied to his tally. How many votes came in for Donald Trump that were flipped to Biden? Hundreds of thousands, including in Virginia, which Fox News called for Biden before the polls were even closed. They were part of that conspiracy because Virginia was one of the states that in fact went for Trump. But Donald Trump didn't have in his attorneys any of that information because he hired Rudy Giuliani, who is deep state, as his attorney. How do I know he's deep state? Because he was involved in 9/11. He was the mayor of New York during 9/11. He was in Building 7 and was told the building's going to be pulled, meaning demolished. Get your people out. He did. But he didn't warn the firefighters in buildings 1 and 2 that they were going to get pulled. So the firefighters to this day hate Rudy Giuliani, but he was drunk most of the time, working for Trump as an attorney, incompetent, and never had any quantitative information to prove to the judges that the election had been stolen. And that's why the judges were capable of dismissing the case, saying, well, you've proven that there were irregularities in the election, but you haven't proven to me that it would have changed the result. Well, the Edison research data would have proved that. But Donald Trump doesn't read the World Affairs Brief. He only listens to Fox News, so he's not going to get this information. And a lot of people have tried to get me to get before Donald Trump and brief him on the history of the deep state. But he has handlers all around him that will not allow that. And I'll tell you that the Daily Mail, for example, had an article, I don't know if you saw that, about a dust up about Laura Loomer. And Laura Loomer knows enough about conspiracy to know that 9/11 was an inside job. So she's known for that. He had her fly on an airplane to the 9/11 memorial that Trump was going to visit. And the press had a fit. You have a 9/11 conspiracy theorist on your airplane, and they tried to crucify Trump, and he quickly distanced himself from her, etc. You can imagine what would happen if they got wind of me briefing Donald Trump, the conspiracy expert in the United States who knows what he's talking about, who has facts. You know, could I turn Donald Trump around? I don't know, really. He's got a massive ego. He has never, ever admitted he's wrong. Do you realize that? He's never admitted error. He told one interviewer when he asked about how he feels about the doctrine of repentance, and he says, you know, I don't relate to repentance. That's a problem. He thinks that Kim Jong-un is his bosom pen pal. He thinks that Xi Jinping, that he could stop any war just by a telephone call to Xi Jinping. He thinks that he can call Vladimir Putin and stop the Ukraine war in a day. He doesn't understand systematic evil. Now, I have no doubt that he wants to make America great again, but he's incapable of doing that. You see, you can't drain the swamp unless you know what I know. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running for president. Now, I'm not going to win. But the reason I'm doing it is because, you know, my World Affairs Brief is a modest subscription price. And, you know, people are used to getting everything free from the internet. Well, I can't live. You know, Chuck Baldwin has hundreds of thousands of people subscribing to his free newsletter, but he's starving to death. Well, except for his parishioners, you know, pay a salary. But the point is, you can't get all information for free. Either you have all this obnoxious advertising on these websites. And you know, you look at the conservative advertising, what's the advertising, you know, about something about, you know, the latest insurance scam in Utah and other types of things. I mean, it's just junk stuff. It's scam stuff that, you know, you're paying for, and it gets in the way. So I don't have advertising on my website. But I try to tell people what's going on from the standpoint of what the deep state is doing. And I try to warn people. Hopefully I'll be able to give people warning of when this war is coming, because a lot of people can't strategically relocate because their jobs are here in the city. And these cities are going to be hell when there's no electricity. When the grid goes down, it's going to be down for a good solid year, because we don't stockpile any of the transformers, the big transformers that transform the thousands of volts of electricity down to the hundreds of volts that you use in your home. And that means pillaging. That means going door to door. That means begging first and then getting violent and stealing what they can steal. And that's why one of the things, it's not enough just to have a safe location to retreat to. You've got to have a safe room in basement space, preferably, where you can conceal it. You've got to be able to get out of the way so that when people are pounding on your door, you don't have to confront them. And I mean, how do you face people, especially if you're Mormon, they know you have some food storage, and tell them you don't have anything? They're not going to believe you. They're going to get violent. You're going to have to be able to get out of the way and to avoid violence. And that's the importance of having a safe room that's concealed. And the cheapest way to do that, of course, is in a basement, where you can do it without a building permit, because it's interior to the house and they don't know about it. And the smart way to do it is to do it yourself. And my son and I have created a book called The High Security Shelter. It's got architectural plans on just how to do that kind of concealed block shelter. And you can haul the block down one by one. It takes a little time. You don't have to pour concrete. You can mix your own mortar with your, and build a shelter and conceal it. And that's important. For those of you that are going to do a remodeling in a house, for adding onto a garage, I've done this book, 700 pages, The Secure Home, everything about architectural design and construction of retreats and high security construction, including shelters and things. So if you're going to add a room, drop a basement below it so that it doesn't look like it's part of your existing basement. And it talks about solar and generators. You're going to have to be able to produce your own power. The nice thing about today's world is that you've got what they call solar generators. And there's an outfit in Idaho called poweredportablesolar.com that has probably the best reviews on all the power generators. But this stuff is plug and play. You can take one of these inverter battery boxes down in your shelter and plug things into it, and just keep it plugged into the grid, and it's good for 2 weeks, you know, once the grid goes down, even if you don't have solar panels on top to recharge it. So you no longer have to bring a solar team of people down into your safe room or shelter to install these things. You can do these things yourself. And I've written the book, Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. This is my best-selling book. Most of you don't need this, but you probably have children that do, that aren't in Utah. Utah and Idaho are the two top-rated states. because of the distance through trackless deserts from the West Coast and the big cities and from Denver, Colorado. So these are some of the books that I've put out so that you can help be prepared for the war that they're coming, they're going to bring upon you. And it's probably going to hit around, probably at the earliest 2027 to 2030. It's going to probably start, the probable trigger event is the Chinese attack on Taiwan. Why a trigger event? Because North Korea said that they're going to intervene militarily against the United States if we try to stop China. And we've got 26,000 troops in North Korea, so we have to intervene if North Korea attacks South Korea and our troops there. And China and North Korea, of course, have a mutual defense pact, and that would be a real great excuse for China to then finally attack U.S. military targets. But they're not ready yet. Now, a lot of hype about the war in Ukraine and Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons on the West. He's threatened that almost a dozen times now. And the reason he hasn't followed through is that he can't occupy, even if he nukes the military in the West or in NATO. And if you can't occupy, they just rebuild and come back after you. So he has to wait for China. And the West is saying, well, by defending Ukraine, we're driving Russia into the arms of China. That's ridiculous. Russia brought Mao Zedong to power. Russia gave them all of the military technology until about 15 years ago when they decided China's getting stronger than we are. We're going to stop sharing our technology with them. And so they've done that. And so we're giving them, the Chinese, the technology, the U.S. Because the globalists are building these centers. All three predator centers, Russia, China, and the New World Order globalists want this war. The globalists want it because that's how they get you into a global New World Order. You want to go there now? You want to legislate a wetlands violation in Brussels and hire an international attorney to do that? That's what happens when you're part of a New World Order. You don't want to do that, and you never will. And the Brits don't want to do it. They tried to get out of the EU, and they had a Brexit, but the Conservative Party sabotaged that. They're still half into it with all the regulations. But let me tell you, if they allow a nuclear first strike to fall on our military, and they come out of their bunkers and say, our military has been decapitated, what are you going to say? Let's fight with what? They'll say we have to join together in a militarized global government to prosecute this war, and nobody's going to say boo. It's just like 9/11. Who protested 9/11? Good for you. But most people went along, and you know, they had the shoe bomber, remember, on an airplane trying to light plastic explosives with a match. That proves he wasn't a terrorist. Every military person knows that you can burn plastic explosive, heat your chow with it, it doesn't explode with a match. That was done by the TSA to make you take off your shoes and all the other things, the garbage they make you do to, even when they had uninterrupted autopilots, that they could stop any hijacking if they wanted to. This is about controls. There are no emergency powers in the Utah Constitution. There's no emergency powers in the U.S. Constitution or any state constitution that allows them to take away fundamental rights in a pandemic. And so even though they took away all of the obnoxious restrictions, did any of them say we're giving up the emergency powers? Not a one. They're still here. And when the next pandemic comes along, you're going to have to deal with it. So that's why you need to be prepared. You need to be prepared to resist. You need to be prepared to say no. And stop being yes man to authority. Now, the last thing I want to cover before I end, though, I want to finish what's happened in the Ukraine. Almost the entire conservative movement is against defending Ukraine against a Russian, thinks Russia's the good guy. And they get that from Ron Paul, who's a good friend of mine, but he's very naive. He, along with Paul Craig Roberts and Alex Jones and Mike Adams and everybody else in the community, virtually everybody but me practically, thinks that anyone the globalists are against must be a good guy. And that is the most stupid conclusion you could ever come to. Why? They got that because of 9/11, because they attacked Iraq, who wasn't guilty of 9/11. They attacked Afghanistan, that wasn't guilty, and spent $13 trillion there and killed a lot of people. And sure, the conservatives are against endless warfare, neocon warfare, and those post 9/11 were all neocon wars. They're all unnecessary. But Russia is an existential enemy. It's still communist. They faked their own demise. Putin even admitted to Tucker Carlson, Lenin and Stalin put the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass and Crimea into the borders of Ukraine, and I don't know why he did that. That was a lie. Of course he knows why. He knew that Lenin had faked his own demise of the Soviet Union to get Western aid and trade once, and Stalin was going to plan to do it in the future. It didn't happen till our day, but Putin knows it. And then you've been told that, of course, we, the Western government, overthrew a legitimate elected government, a president in Ukraine to start this war, and that's why Putin is justified in invading Ukraine. But that's a lie.
Is that a lie? Why is that a lie?
I'll tell you why it's a lie.
I'm all ears.
Will you shut up?
I can't wait for your more lies.
All right. Let me.
I'm all ears.
All right. I'm going to give you facts, and you're not going to be able to debunk any of them. Viktor Yanukovych was a communist. Now, when the communists faked their own demise in the Soviet Union, they did not remove any of the other communists in the former Soviet states. None of them were removed from the bureaucracy. All of the people complained, we're still having to pay bribes to the communists in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and especially Ukraine, and that's why it was so corrupt. And that's why the Bidens were able to do business with Burisma, because of that. All right.
One word we didn't hear was Netanyahu.
Well, there's one in every crowd, isn't there? All right, now let me finish, because this is very, very important. It is true that he was elected. Now, if the election was fair, I don't believe there's ever been a fair election in a former communist country like Ukraine. But because all of the former presidents, even Tymoshenko, who claims to be a Ukrainian nationalist, is still a Putin puppet. She was corrupt in getting money from the Gazprom and other oil and gas concessions in there. But Viktor Yanukovych is also an ally of Putin, and everybody knew it in there. He won the election. The protest started because they thought it was a fraudulent election. And it's true that Victoria Nuland, the globalist, helped fund that protest. Now, it wasn't $5 billion that Paul Craig Roberts said. That was the entire budget. That was the entire budget for all of democracy now in Eastern Europe. A portion of that came to Ukraine, and they did fund the protest. But what you're missing in the information is how the protest ended, because the protesters did not win on their own. The protesters were in the Maidan Square, which is the major independent square in Kiev, and they were surrounded by the Berkut, which is the riot police, and they're ruthless, SWAT team type. They had killed several protesters. They had tortured several of them. They had kept them surrounded. Even in the wintertime, they had to burn tires to keep warm, and they had to smuggle food in there to keep them with food. That's how tense it was in the protest in the Maidan Revolution. This is 2014. Well, in February of 2014, Viktor Yanukovych claimed that he was going to have a meeting with the protest leaders, 3 of them, and make a deal. And the deal was that he was going to step down temporarily and have an interim president and then a new election. But the protesters rejected the deal because they said Yanukovych was not negotiating with us, but the 3 guys that he chose were not true protesters. So they smelled a rat. So they rejected the deal on Friday. This was a Thursday when the deal was announced. They rejected it on Thursday evening. On Friday morning, the protesters woke up and there was no Berkut to be found. They were not surrounded anymore. Who could have given the orders to the Berkut to stand down? The protesters? Victoria Nuland? No. Only Yanukovych. In fact, it wasn't Yanukovych. It was his hand-picked leader of the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, in which the communists had a majority in control. He gave the order for the Berkut to stand down. The protesters left the Maidan Square, walked into the presidential palace, and there was no guards on the palace. Now that's like the Trump protesters going up to the Capitol and there's no Capitol Police on it. Who could have given the orders to stand down the police? Only Nancy Pelosi. Now that's the evidence he didn't stick around for. Now, why would Yanukovych do this? Why would he let the protesters win? Because you see, just like the phony fall of the Soviet Union to deceive the West into giving them aid and trade, Yanukovych is going to fake his own demise to pave the way for Putin to be able to invade. And here's how he does it. After he flees for his life, this was on Saturday. Friday, remember, the Berkut were not there. The protesters won. On Saturday, Yanukovych flees from his life. He asks, who is he fleeing from because the protesters are not armed? Well, he fled and went to Russia. And the Rada voted him out of office. That's like the Democrats in Congress voting out Barack Obama. Who's going to believe that that was the protesters or the West? Because the communists had a majority. But they did have an interim president, Yashchenuk. He was in there for a couple of months, and then they had new elections, and guess who gets elected? Petro Poroshenko. Now, he's another phony nationalist, claiming to be pro-Ukrainian. He campaigned on the issue that I'm going to let the Russian speaking people in the Donbass be self-determining so that they don't complain anymore. I'm going to let them speak Russian. They don't have to speak Ukrainian. So he gets elected, and what does he do? He says, no, you can't be self-determining, and you have to speak Ukrainian. You can't speak Russian. He begins to antagonize them as soon as he becomes elected. And what happens? Vladimir Putin says, I'm coming to the defense of the Russians, and he starts that stealth invasion of Crimea. That's how it happened. Now, could Yanukovych have done that? Could Yanukovych have persecuted the Russians? No, he would have said, what's Yanukovych doing there? He's a pro-Putin Russian. Why would he be persecuting us? So you see, you need to put a fake nationalist in to do the persecuting. Now that's what really happened in the Ukraine. And all the conservative leaders that you listen to don't know this. And they're convinced that Russia's the good guy. They're convinced he's a Christian because he's helping the Orthodox Church. Well, I'll tell you why he's helping the Orthodox Church. Do you know that the Orthodox Church never protested any of the deaths caused by Stalin in the Soviet Union? Not one peep. Why? Because the Soviets infiltrated the entire church hierarchy with communists. And they did so in Ukraine as well, and that's why Zelensky had to ban the Ukrainian church, because they were fifth column, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, Putin, of course, inhibits the Mormons and the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, but not the Catholic or not the Orthodox Church, because it's still controlled. So this is what things that you have to know in order to avoid these things. Now, Donald Trump, of course, one of his biggest errors was allowing the NSA to talk him into killing General Qasem Soleimani of Iran. The NSA told Donald Trump that he was the biggest terrorist sponsor in the world. Remember that? They killed him coming into Damascus on a diplomatic mission, diplomatic passport, and he killed him. And he raved about it. He brags about it to this day. I solved the terrorist problem. But Donald Trump's a fool. He doesn't know that the deep state created all of this terrorists, including ISIS, as I've explained. And Soleimani was, in fact, the biggest sponsor militarily and money for the Iraqi militia that was fighting ISIS. It wasn't the U.S. that defeated ISIS. It was the Iraqi militia that defeated ISIS. They're the ones that kicked them out of Mosul. In fact, the Iraqi parliament has videotapes of U.S. military helicopters coming in and rescuing ISIS leaders from Mosul and flying them out of the country, and demanded that the U.S. give them answers. And the U.S. never responded. And then the U.S. rescued ISIS out of the last battle of Raqqa in Syria, where they supposedly their demise. They had a ceasefire, and they hired 50 Arab drivers and semi-trucks to come in and take ISIS, their families, and their heavy weapons, which is never done in a ceasefire. You're supposed to leave your weapons behind. Took all their weapons back to Syria where they belong and reintegrated them into the Syrian rebels where they started. Now that's what really happened to ISIS and Iraq and Syria. And we have no business still occupying Syrian oil fields with U.S. troops to keep Syria from rebuilding. Bashar al-Assad is not the enemy. So the world is upside down, ladies and gentlemen. And it's hard to convince people like we saw here today who are, I don't know, don't want to listen. But I can tell you that I've had a great deal of resistance. I've lost probably 25% of my subscribers over trying to explain this to them, that Russia's not the good guy. And someday you'll all be believers because Russia will someday attack this country and China. Now, of course, the conservatives who believe Russia's the good guy will think we put them up to it and we are the blame for them attacking us. But believe me, they've still been communist and they are systematically evil. So that's the situation in the world today. And one of the reasons I'm running for president, not because I'm going to win, but because when this is all over, you're all going to be hopping mad and disappointed and anguished when you see this country take a very dramatic increased spiral downward. When you have someone like Kamala Harris in charge, it's going to be very bad. The border is just going to flood with people, and they're going to start weaponizing all of things. In today's World Affairs Brief, I talked about the fact that they're starting to prosecute and send to jail county clerks who are preserving election records as evidence of fraud when the state tells them to erase those records. They just sent a Colorado county clerk to jail for 9 years in prison for keeping copies of the records that prove fraud when the state told her to erase them. Now, how do you regain back your country when the judicial system is weaponized against you? It's really going to get bad. Well, the Lord will always preserve a remnant if you're wise and if you prepare. We have to survive this war to be preserved, and eventually there will be some safe places still remaining in rural places. They won't be in any of the cities. They have to be in rural places. So part of my call to you is to listen to your conscience, listen to your thing, and get prepared. Do the sacrifice now that it takes to prepare a safe haven. Because you may think it's impossible now, you may think it's tough, but think when there's no electricity, no job, and no income at all, then you know what really tough is. And then there is no chance to prepare. There are no solar systems you can buy. There's no batteries. There's no generators. Walmart is picked clean. So is Home Depot. You only have despair. So now's the time to prepare while we still have time. And we do have time. I still think we've got at least 3 or 4 years and maybe to as late as 2030. If it doesn't happen by then, remember, just keep watching Russia and China. They're still at it. They're still preparing. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.